Hello guys, welcome back to Pirates of Medicine. Today we are back with another video in the anatomy based series. We're going to start from the last question that we left in the last video. So before we start, please do the same thing all over again. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please like the video, and if you found the last couple of videos helpful for your croc preparation, please consider sharing these videos with your friends. So anyway, without any further delay, let's begin with the video. Okay, so the 21st question says that the patient has come to the hospital from the smelting workshop in the condition of hypothermia. What is the direct cause of loss of consciousness at the heat stroke? So clearly there has been a case of heat stroke in the patient. So let's talk about heat stroke first. So medically, heat stroke is defined as an increase in core body temperature greater than 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and there are certain complications that involve the certain central nervous system that occur due to exposure to these higher temperatures. So other common symptoms may include nausea, seizures, confusion, disorientation, and even sometimes loss of consciousness or even coma. So heat syncope is caused by, syncope is loss of consciousness. So heat syncope is caused by peripheral vessel dilation. So what happens during hyperthermia or heat stroke is that your vessels on the peripheral part of your body, like the skin, the dermal vessels, they get dilated. So when vessels get dilated, there is increased blood filling in those vessels. So there is more blood in the peripheral vessels, and you can notice that this phenomena because during heat stroke your skin becomes quite red. Correct. So if because of this peripheral vessel dilation, all the blood of the body gets redirected towards the peripheral vessels, which will result diminished blood flow to the brain and dehydration of the body. Now this diminished blood flow to the brain causes the symptoms of unconsciousness. So what is the treatment you give to such patient? The first aid that you can give is that you need to move the patient to an air conditioned environment or at least a cool and shaded place. Then you do the regular thing, you apply ice packs to the patient's armpits, groin, neck and back, because these areas are rich in the blood vessels, peripheral vessels, which needs to be cooled down so that they can become constricted again, and also this will reduce the body's temperature. Then you can immerse the patient in shower or a tub of cool water to help more. Also, if there is a paramedical staff nearby or during the transfer of patient to the hospital for further treatment, IV fluids can be administered to compensate for the fluid and electrolyte loss and to help with the dehydration. So in the patient, you can clearly see that the patient came from a smelting workshop. Smelting workshop has to do something with a hyperthermic environment, and this patient had hyperthermia. So the loss of consciousness in this case will be decreased brain blood supply because the blood has gone to the peripheral vessel, causing the given symptoms. Okay, so let's go to the next one. 22nd question is about the ESR or erythrocyte sedimentation rate. In 22nd question, a patient's blood was analyzed and the decreased erythrocyte sedimentation rate was discovered. So what disease from the given below is accompanied with decreased ESR? So let's talk about ESR. So erythrocyte sedimentation rate is a rate at which the red blood cells in an anticoagulated whole blood, they descend in a standardized tube over a period of time. So you take a tube, you take a sample of blood and you observe the blood for over a period of 1 hour, and normally you see that the red blood cells, they settle down as a sediment. So it is a common hematology test and it is a non-specific measure of inflammation. So what happens is ESR can be increased or decreased in certain situations. For example, ESR is commonly increased in conditions like inflammation. It is quite increased in pregnant women. It is increased in case of anemia and autoimmune disorders. and infections. The logic behind this is that for example, when the ESR is increased, the sedimentation rate is increased, which means that the time by which the erythrocytes settle down up to that given level would be increased, because there are less amount of erythrocytes in the body, which you can see that, because this is the reason that can be due to anemia. Now, when there is when there is decreased ESR, that means the erythrocytes, they settle down quite quickly. So it would be seen in cases when there are a lot of red blood cells in the body, which is seen in polycythemia, when there are new or reticulocytes present in the body, and polycythemia means there are more cells as compared to the plasma levels. There is hyperviscosity, which is a condition when the ESR can be decreased, and there's sickle cell anemia, there's leukemia, there's low plasma proteins like due to liver or kidney diseases, or even congestive heart failure. So the essence of this question is that ESR is just the rate at which erythrocytes settle down the tube. So in case of ESR being increased, it would be due to, say, inflammation, pregnancy, autoimmune diseases, infections, or even some kidney diseases and cancers. ESR is decreased in case of polycythemia, hyperviscosity, sickle cell anemia, leukemia, chronic fatigue syndrome, in case of low plasma proteins, and congestive heart failure. So I think that pretty much sums it up. They asked about a condition in which ESR will be decreased. We have it, polycythemia. So let's go to the next one. Before we go to the next one, these are some normal ESR values. You should remember in your clinical practice that in males at the age of 0 to 50, the ESR is less than 15 mm per hour. In females, it is slightly higher, which is around less than 20 mm per hour. Because there are less amount of erythrocytes in females due to menstruation, and also due to the effect of estrogen on hemopoiesis. We'll talk about later in a video. Here, so as the age increases, you can notice a pattern that in both males and female, as the age increases, the ESR increases quite like steadily. So this is the normal ESR values. I think that sums it up. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so in 23rd question, a patient 55-year-old is hospitalized in result of the trauma of a medial group of femoral muscles. It's asking about the kind of movements this patient is unable to do. Okay, so let's talk about the medial group of femoral muscles. So the medial group of femoral muscles, as you can see in this video, they are located towards the medial side of the body. This medial group is responsible for the function of adduction of femur and rotating it laterally. So in the first video, we talked about this normal anatomical movement. So adduction of femur and rotation of this femur laterally, which means away from the body. This function is responsible. This function is carried out by the medial group of femoral muscles. So by their function, they are also called as hip adductors. So there are 5 main muscles in these groups. There are musculus gracilis, muscle obturator externus, musculus abductor brevis, abductor longus, and adductor magnus. So all these adductor muscles are responsible for adduction of the femur and rotating it laterally. So I think that sums it up. Which muscles are responsible? What is the function of medial group of femoral muscles? That is adduction of femur. Let's go to the next one. So in this case, a mother of a newborn complains that her baby's constant belching with undigested milk. So what is this symptom of which developmental anomaly is this an evidence or symptom of? So this is a classic symptom that is clearly observed in a case of esophageal atresia. Esophageal atresia can be simply explained by that the esophagus is not properly developed. There is a loss of connection between the esophagus, between the one part of esophagus. It is discontinued, and in some cases there can be formation of a tracheoesophageal fistula. Fistula is a abnormal connection between two structures. So in this case you can see the esophagus is in connection with the trachea and forming a tracheoesophageal fistula. So esophageal atresia is an abnormality or birth defect of the esophagus that occurs in early pregnancy when the baby is developing. So the esophagus forms during the first few months, and any disorder of the gestational period can cause this defect, which leads to esophageal tube being disrupted. So what are the symptoms that you may observe in a newborn with a esophageal atresia complicated with tracheoesophageal fistula? First of all, due to a direct connection between the trachea and the esophagus, you can see that there comes frothy and white bubbles in the mouth of the baby. Another thing is that there is a coughing or choking when the baby is trying to feed, because you think about yourself, there's only one way that the food can go through, here to the trachea, and trachea is responsible for breathing. So you can't do the same thing at the same time. You can't eat and breathe at the same time. So therefore these classical belching and these frothy white bubbles are seen in the baby. This vomiting occurs as a reflex, and also due to the food disrupting the trachea, there would be cyanosis because hypoxia, and then there's also difficulty breathing as asphyxia. So this is the classical esophageal atresia or developmental anomaly, and this is seen the classical symptom, constant belching with undigested milk. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so 25th question is that during the endoscopy of the inflammation of a major papilla of the duodenum and the disturbances of bile secretion were found. So in what part of duodenum were these problems found? So they're talking about the major papilla of the duodenum. So let's talk about the major papilla. Major duodenal papilla, or the papilla of Vater as we commonly call it, is the point on the intestine where the dilated junction of the bile and pancreatic ducts, the ampulla of Vater, enter the duodenum. So see, this is the cystic common bile duct, and this is the major duodenal papilla. It is the opening of the pancreatic and bile duct into the duodenum. So the ampulla is surrounded by the sphincter of Oddi, which not only controls the flow of bile and pancreatic juice into the duodenum, but also prevents the reflux of duodenal contents, bile and pancreatic juice, back into the bile and pancreatic ducts. So where is it located? It is located on the longitudinal fold on the medial part of descending part of the duodenum. So it has this specific location on the medial part of the descending duodenum. It is located on the longitudinal folds. So this is the major duodenal papilla. So they asked about the major duodenal papilla, their location, in which part of duodenum, specifically in the longitudinal folds of the medial descendant part of the duodenum. Now there is also the minor duodenal papilla. So while we are at it, why don't we just cover it? So the minor duodenal papilla is actually the opening of the accessory pancreatic duct into the descending second section of the duodenum. It is situated 2 cm proximal to the major duodenal papilla, thus about 5 to 8 cm away from the opening of the pylorus. So you can see this minor duodenal papilla is located over here, and the major duodenal papilla is located over here. So this is the opening of the accessory pancreatic duct. That pretty much covers this one. So let's jump to the next one. So the 22nd question we have is that an 18-year-old patient came to an outpatient department with the complaints of bleeding trauma in the vestibule of the nose. On examination, there is a mechanical injury of the mucous layer of the vestibule without continuation into the nasal cavity proper. So just the mucous layer of the outer vestibule is injured. So they're asking what is the anatomical boundary between the vestibule and nasal cavity. So when you study ENT, you come to this in the first topic, that anatomy of the in the first nose topic, about the anatomy of the nose. So there's the vestibule part and there's the nasal cavity proper. So this is the outer vestibule part, the part exposed to the outer environment, and this is the nasal cavity proper. Okay, so the anatomical boundary between them is known as the nasal limen, the nasal bridge, or the limen nasi in Latin. So it separates the vestibule from the rest of the nasal cavity and marks the change from the skin of the vestibule to the respiratory epithelium of the rest of the nasal cavity. Okay, so this area is also known as the mucocutaneous junction and also has a dense microvasculature. So I think that pretty much sums it, that the anatomical boundary between these two parts is limen nasi or nasal limen. So let's go to the next one. Okay, a 32-year-old patient has been diagnosed with Bartholinitis or inflammation of Bartholin's glands. They didn't mention, but this is a female patient. And in what part of in what part of a female urogenital system are the Bartholin's glands located? So Bartholin glands are also called as Bartholin glands or greater vestibular glands are two pea-sized glands located in the labia majora surrounding the vagina and the urethra in females. So what is their function? They secrete mucus to lubricate the vagina and they are homologous to the bulbourethral glands in the males. So their function is just secretion of mucus to help with coitus, to have a smooth coitus. So that's all their function is. So they are located on the labia majora. That's all we need to know. Okay, so 28th question is a bit big one. They're talking about that a 50-year-old patient had hemorrhage of the brain and was taken to the hospital. The place of hemorrhage was revealed on the lateral hemisphere surface during the medical examination. So what artery was injured? I'm sorry about the spelling, but for the question that I copied from is from a base and translation mechanism in Ukraine. I'm sorry about that. So anyway, we're talking about the blood supply of the skull. So let's talk about from where the major blood supply of the skull is originated. So actually the main branches of the arteries that supply the skull, they branch out from the carotid arteries and the subclavian artery. So let's see where these main arteries they branch out from. So subclavian and the carotid arteries, they branch off right from the arc of aorta. The aorta ascends from the heart. It forms this arc and then descends. At the arc of aorta, it is divided into the brachiocephalic artery, the left common carotid artery, and the subclavian artery. Now, the brachiocephalic artery further divides into the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. Let's talk about the internal carotid artery. So the internal carotid artery is a branch of the common carotid artery. The other branch is the external carotid artery. So they divide further from the common carotid artery. And in the skull, there are some branches that the internal carotid artery gives and that are important to remember. So here we have a mnemonic, a VIP is comma. So you can remember it for A, anterior choroidal artery, B, V for Vidian artery, I for inferior lateral trunk, P for posterior communicating trunk, S for superior hypophyseal artery, C corticotympanic artery, O for ophthalmic artery, M for meningiohypophyseal trunk, M for middle cerebral artery, A for anterior cerebral artery. So for this question and majorly the three main important arteries that you need to remember is anterior cerebral artery, which you can see it supplies the anterior portion of the frontal portion of the brain. Then you need to remember the middle cerebral artery, which you can see it supplies the lateral part of the skull. You can see over here the lateral part near the ear or the temporal bone or the maxillary part of the temporal bone. Yes, correct. So lateral part of the skull is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. And also the ophthalmic artery, it supplies the area around the eye socket. Yes, and also the posterior communicating artery is important as well. So we'll talk about it more in the last slide of this question. Let's go to the branches of external carotid. External carotid is a simpler concept. There's this external carotid that continues from the neck region and divides into a tree-like structure. The first branch to go out is the superior thyroid artery. You can use she always likes friends over papa, sister and mama. So as for superior thyroid artery, supplies the region around the thyroid gland. Then we have the ascending pharyngeal artery, then the lingual artery supplying the tongue, then the facial artery, then the occipital artery, then the posterior auricular artery, the one that goes behind your ear, and the maxillary branch or the maxillary artery, and then the superficial temporal artery. So these are the main branches of external carotid. So let's talk about the blood supply of the skull. We have the middle cerebral artery, which is the largest branch of the internal carotid. We talked about it in the previous slide. And the artery supplies a portion of the frontal lobe, the lateral surface of the temporal and parietal lobes, including the primary motor and sensory areas of the face, throat, arms, and the dominant hemisphere, the areas of the speech. So middle cerebral artery, it supplies some portion of the frontal lobe, but the majority it supplies the lateral surface of the temporal and parietal lobes. The anterior cerebral artery, from its name, it supplies the medial and the superior parts of the frontal lobe and the anterior parietal lobe. And there are two short anterior communicating arteries which join the two anterior cerebral arteries of the left and the right. Then there is the posterior cerebral artery which supplies the occipital lobe, the inferior part of the temporal lobe, and various deep structures including the thalamus and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Posterior communicating artery supplies the thalamus, hypothalamus, optic chiasm, and the mammillary body. So right here we have another, like we talked about the branches of internal and external carotid. The posterior communicating branch, it is actually formed from this artery which is called the basilar artery, which comes from the left and right vertebral artery and the right subclavian arteries. So this is the branching structure of the posterior communicating that was left, and all these branches, they form this cerebral arterial circles around the brain. You can see that this anterior communicating branches joins the anterior cerebral. There is this middle cerebral, there is this ophthalmic at the back, posterior communicating around here. So they form this circle around the head which is called as circle of Willis. So this is the blood supply of the skull. Going back to the question, they just asked about the hemorrhage being located on the lateral hemisphere and ask what artery was injured. So lateral hemisphere are supplied by the middle cerebral artery, which you all know by now. So that's why the answer is middle cerebral artery. And you also learned the blood supply of the rest branches. Okay, so 29th question is that a 30-year-old patient was hospitalized due to bleeding of the facial artery. What place on the face has to be pressed to stop the bleeding? So facial artery, we knew that it is a branch of external carotid. So you can see the facial artery here being diverged from the external carotid right here, right around the mandible's edge, where the mandible's edge is supposed to be. This is the part where mandible is, right? So in case of bleeding of facial artery and its branches, it is quite wise, and the step is to press the mandible's edge to compress this artery right here, so that the blood supply or the loss of blood or hemorrhage from this artery can be stopped. So the point at which facial artery is to be pressed in case of bleeding, it is called as digital compression, is the mandible's edge. So mandible's edge. Okay, so a 19-year-old patient was diagnosed with appendicitis and was hospitalized. The surgical operation on the ablating appendix vermiformis is to be performed. So what artery must be fixed to stop bleeding during the surgical operation? So about this question, we learned about the arterial supply of the lower intestines in the previous question. Let's remember what we learned about the blood supply of the vermiform appendix. So the blood supply of the appendix is from the ileocecal artery, which gives appendicular artery branches. This is the appendix. Ileocholic artery is a branch of the superior mesenteric artery which gives the appendicular artery branches and supply the appendix. So that's all we need to know, that appendicular artery are supplied by the ileocholic artery. So the blood supply of the appendix is from the ileocholic artery. Correct? So I think that's all for this video. So I think that's all for this video. Thank you for sticking around and watching this. And if these videos are being helpful for you, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing these videos to your other friends who want to give grok this year. So if you have any suggestions or any suggestions or any reviews, please consider commenting below so that I can know if these videos are helping or not. And also, if you have any questions that you don't understand, drop down a comment below so that I can help you somehow, maybe provide an explanation in the comment. I'll try my best. So anyway, so it's been good, this one. See you in the next one.